In a world overflowing with distractions, we seek meaning. How do we transform ambition into something deeper, into true fulfillment? I'm Sam, CEO of Course Educa, and I've spent years helping businesses succeed by connecting their goals to something bigger. On the Meaningful Podcast, we explore not just how to win in business, but how to grow as individuals. Through conversation with thought leaders, innovators, and everyday heroes, we uncover the stories that drive us towards something greater. Whether you're striving for success, seeking purpose, or just looking for the next steps in your journey, this podcast is your guide to navigating the intersection of ambition, growth, and meaning. So please join me and our incredible guests as we redefine what's possible in both business and life. Enjoy. You can never outperform the image you hold of yourself. You must first become the person, then the result follows. Welcome to the Meaningful Podcast. I'm your host, Sam. Today we're exploring the science behind mindset transformation, how belief shapes reality through the law of attractions, and why true leadership begins with mastering yourself first. Patricia Stepler is the founder of Creating Top Producers, where she helps entrepreneurs and business leaders master their mindset, boost productivity, and unlock time and money freedom. A former educator turned mindset mentor, Patricia's journeys began when her son manifested a full college scholarship, an experience that led her to study directly under the legendary Bob Proctor. Today, she blends universal success practices and principles for practical strategy to help people rewrite limiting belief, align with purpose, and step into the next version of who they're meant to be. If you enjoyed this discussion, please let the world know with a like, a small review, or even a quick share. It supports how more people find meaningful content just like this. Let's begin. Patricia Stepler, welcome on the Meaningful Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Sam. Thank you for having me today.
Well, it's lovely having you, and I hope that you're having fun in Pennsylvania. I hope the weather is great. It is phenomenal on the East Coast here in Montreal. So it's always great to wake up with the sun.
Yes.
But to kick us off, please tell us more about Creating Top Producers.
Creating Top Producers is all about helping people to unleash their potential and realize that they have so much more to offer to the world and to society than they may believe.
Interesting. So tell me more about, they have more to offer to society than what they believe. Is that professionally? Is that personally? Tell me more about what it is.
I think they coincide. You know, your professional life is a reflection of your personal life. Your personal life is a reflection of what you do in your professional life. So I think it's coinciding.
Interesting. So it's unleashing a better version of yourself. Absolutely. Altogether, I suppose. Very interesting. So take me back to the beginning of all of this, I suppose. Were you always interested in perhaps life optimizations, or how did that came into your life?
No, so I say my former life, I was a school teacher. And, you know, it's really important to me to encourage my students, as well as I have 3 children of my own. And it was really important to become a really good mom and to raise kids that were going to be successful and to, you know, offer something to society. So it was always a passion of mine to be able to help people improve from where they are. And I studied personal development my entire adult life.
Interesting. I really want to start with sort of from manifestation to mission, because it seemed like it plays a really big part basically in your own journey. Like you said, you really start with the powerful manifestations for your son full scholarships, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And that really sort of basically forever shift your paths in that case. Tell us more about what did that first manifestation teach you, I suppose, about the power and our power to shape reality altogether.
Yeah, that was when I really pivoted from the education world into business world. My son had told me when he was 12 that he was going to get a full scholarship to college. I didn't need to worry about saving money for him. And, you know, at the time, even though I'd done all the personal development, I didn't believe him, because he told me he was going to be a collegiate athlete. And I thought, well, what are the odds? You know, and then he decided it was going to be baseball. And then it was really like baseball. There's no money in baseball, not like football or basketball, which he also played. And, you know, but I didn't tell him, I didn't believe him. He never knew it. You know, every time he would tell me at least once a week that he was going to be this collegiate athlete and get this full scholarship. And I would just go along with him and, was really proud of the goals that he was achieving no matter what sport he was playing. And, he went, and just like everybody, he had difficulties. He could have given up so many times because things did not go right. I mean, we're talking 6 years, from the time he first came up with this idea till he graduated. And he had disappointments and discouragements along the way, but he kept focused on that goal. And so when he actually did get that scholarship, I was so excited for him, but I also was angry with myself because what you don't realize is he also had a lot of medical issues going on. He had 2 lazy eyes that he had to have therapy on. He had, when he was little, his legs were bowed, so he had to wear a brace then. And then when he was 8, he was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes. So he wore an insulin pump. And so it was a really difficult time for him. And, when you look at all the health issues, and he just kept pushing through. And I think that's what really amazed me, how he did that and, kept that dream forefront in his mind.
Right. The power of belief is obviously so huge. It's interesting you mentioned that you never tried to interrupt him in his dreams, right? Even if you did not really believe it was possible, you still probably didn't step into his realms, because I love to see world as realities sort of colliding upon itself. So I have my reality, your reality in this case, and the conversation, the reality, as perhaps a tangible and factual manner of our environments. And in my reality, if I fully wholeheartedly think I'm going to be a scholarship athlete, even if it's yours, that it's a little bit distant, perhaps, or a little bit, let's say, the chances are a little bit less. If you don't interrupt with my reality, I continue upon this dream, and like you said, I keep pushing through those barriers. Now, you mentioned about the fact that once he got it, he felt a little bit bad. Was it because you formally didn't think it was possible for him, or tell me more about sort of the emotion?
So I felt bad, not for him. I was angry with me, because I'm like, how did he achieve this? And I never believed he would achieve it. And like, how did he do that? And why hadn't I done something so amazing? And that set me on my journey to I had to figure out what he had done, because I knew that obviously in all the personal development I've done, I didn't have the answer. And so that led me to searching for somebody who did have the answer. And that's when I stumbled upon Bob Proctor. Now, Bob Proctor is a name I had heard of, and I knew he was into personal development. But for some reason, over those 30 years, we never crossed paths. And, all of a sudden he appeared, and in a video I happened to be watching, and I was like, this man knows the answer. And then I couldn't get enough of him, because I needed to learn the things that he taught about the laws of the universe and manifesting your goals and keeping that focus and, having that goal that inspires you. I needed to learn all that information that I'd never gotten before.
Yeah, Bob Proctor is an indirect mentor of mine. Obviously, Universal Laws, the Art of Money Gathering as well. M1, M2, M3. Really did change my life altogether. But you studied under him, which is very much obviously a blessing. I'm sure you'll agree with me on that. And it's interesting for me. This whole, Jim Rohns is another one of a guy perhaps in the same sort of niche personal development, Napoleon Hill as well, which was the first book that I've read personally, Think and Grow Rich. So it's very, very interesting. These laws of success that seems to be just they're just factual. Perhaps they're just basically they're laws for a reason. Is because they just exist. And really, to me, when I look at Bob Proctor, I didn't have the chance to study under him. Obviously, never talked to him perhaps, but you had, as a man outside perhaps of the realms of the educations, I suppose. How was he? How was Bob just on a normal Tuesday grabbing dinner?
Yeah, so he was really amazing. I remember one time, so I became a consultant with his company, and then after about a year, I studied personally with him for a year, and sometimes it was hard to imagine that this man who knew so much was just like you and I. And I'll never forget one time we were at a consultant training, and he'd gotten a new laptop, and he was frustrated with this laptop. And so he was asking for his old laptop to be brought up. And he said, I don't like change. And, probably all of us, our mouths just dropped, because here was this person who, was so into being able to change and be flexible. And he goes, nobody likes change. I don't like it either. And it just humanized him, that he was just like the rest of us. He was just, his awareness level was just so much higher. And he knew, he had studied this information and, really went on, why is it that the mind, the subconscious mind just keeps pulling you back to those things that you don't really want?
Right. What do you think is the most life-changing principle that he taught you?
I think that the most life-changing principle is really the stick figure, if you've ever heard of the stick figure. And it was funny because Sandy Gallagher, who was his partner, she had the same attitude I did the first time I saw it, like, this is ridiculous. But the more you study it, the more you start to understand, and the power that the subconscious mind controls so much of what we do. And when you really start to study it, 95 to 98% of our day is habitual. And so we don't really think about what we're doing. We just, go into action. And I'm sure most of us have had this experience where you're driving down the road, and maybe it's the road you take to work, but you're not going to work. And then all of a sudden you exit the road like you are going to work. And it's like, that's not where I was headed. And, because it was just habitual. You weren't thinking. And, I know there were other times I'd get to, when I was teaching, I'd get to school and I'd think, did I go through a red light this morning? You're just not conscious of what you're doing because your life is so habitual. And I think understanding that those habits are controlling everything we do, and they control our actions. So if we have that limiting belief, that control is in the subconscious mind, and it's going to keep us from actually achieving what we want. And so when you realize that, and that becomes an understanding that, so often we don't do what we want to do because our conscious mind is not controlling our actions. Our subconscious mind is. And that's where all those limiting beliefs are stored.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, success is something you attract by the person you become. And that's really sort of the bottom of it is, I think Jim Rohn said it the absolute best. He said, if you want more than what you have, you'll need to become more than who you are, right? So you'll need to, this current version of yourself will need to be killed by the next version of yourself that perhaps, and that's what progress is. You emphasis a lot on mindset, right? You help a lot of people with mindsets, and you also talk about it as a real foundation for business growth, not just tactics, which is quite interesting. I'm really interested in you sort of explaining, how can someone know if their mindset is the bottleneck in their business? What's the few perhaps red flags, as the youngsters say these days, that mindset might be the actual biggest problem, not systems, not offers, so on and so forth?
Could be when you go to make a decision and then you worry about it. Because when you worry, or when you have fear, or when you doubt that you're making that right decision, it probably gets back to your mindset. And so I think a lot of times we don't really maybe know what we want for sure. And so then we worry that maybe we've made the wrong decision. But anytime you have that limiting belief or that doubt that you can do something that you want to do. So here's the thing I always think of. And, I don't believe that we're given an idea that we cannot accomplish, because I don't believe God does that to us. He doesn't dangle something out there and say, oh, this is what you want, but I'm not going to let you have it. So when you get that idea, that's something you actually can accomplish. Maybe you have to grow first, though. You probably, if it's a really big goal, you're probably not the person you need to be yet, just like you were talking about with Jim Rohn. And, so you have to maybe grow yourself. And you have to change something that you're doing, and you have to figure that out. But if you're given that idea, you can go after it. But if you worry, or you doubt, or you dismiss it, or you say, I can't do it, or I'm not good enough to do it, then that's a red flag that it's a mindset issue.
I love you cite obviously the source God, the creator. It's very interesting because I saw this very interesting. It was one of the books that I was reading. He said he was talking about the fact that let's say you ask God for courage. Well, God will just not just grant you courage out of thin air. He will give you challenges that you can overcome, and therefore, through overcoming those challenges, you'll become more courageous. So there's always this interesting thing, and I learned this from one of my mentor of mine that's the road to success is full of failures, but it's the same road. I used to think when I was younger that there's the road on the right is failure, the road on the left is success. On the road of success, it's nothing but paved gold. There's nothing, there is no failure, there's no potholes, there's nothing but perhaps a wedding aisle. And that's not life. Life is very much a intertwining those challenges because you need to become again that person that is necessary to achieve that bigger goal, which I think is exceptionally wise, perhaps. From that perspective, you were talking about limiting belief. One of my favorite things to study. I love it so much. And you talk a lot about before scaling up, right? Leaders often need to scale down the belief holding them back, which is an interesting play on word there. And I'm really interested from your perspective to tell me what are some of the most common limiting beliefs that you see amongst entrepreneurs, the high achievers, those in which perhaps are achieving great things, but still have these all sorts of limiting belief and chaos in our psychological endeavor.
So that's kind of an interesting question because I was in this group of speakers and we were at a retreat a few years ago, and we're all coaches and consultants. And the overwhelming majority, when asked what they felt their limiting belief was, it came back to not being good enough. I was like, oh my gosh, that is amazing. So many, here are people who are helping others to achieve. And yet, as a group, the majority of us felt like we weren't good enough. And I think that is huge. And I think that impacts us. And so it's like, well, where does that come from? Why do we believe we're not good enough? And so I had to look at my own life. Why did I believe I wasn't good enough? Well, for me, I always said my parents were very outgoing. I was very introverted. And I had a brother who was a year older than me who just everything came so easily to him. And for me, I had to work at it. And, and I thought, well, that always impacted my life. That made me feel like I wasn't good enough. And so I had to find something that I was good at, and that became music. And when I got into high school, I took voice lessons. I've been taking piano lessons all along, but I really got serious about it. And, I played the flute, I played the violin, did a little bit of organ. And, it was like, that's where I found like that was something I was good at. And it was the first time I ever felt like I was good at anything, which is what led me to go into music and to be a music teacher. And, I think that's a lot of those feelings come from our childhood. And, because those paradigms, those habitual habits we have, they're formed when we're very young, before we have the ability to say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would I feel I'm not good enough? Well, somebody says something, you see people do things that are, more than what you think you can do. And so you just start to feel you're not good enough. And just like you were talking about the pathway to success, we often see successful athletes or musicians, and they're at the top of their career, or they've done something amazing. We think it just came so easily to them. But if you go back into their history, then you'll find out, first of all, they worked their tails off, and they, had disappointments just like everybody else, because nobody has a straight path to success.
100%. I love exploring this concept of competence is what builds confidence. So confidence, some people have it, I think, a little bit more innately, like you said, the way they were raised. Obviously, if you were someone that was denigrated by your environment when you were very little, that typically marked basically even yourself in your teenage years and afterwards in your adult years. But really, like you said, you were seeking something to be good at first. And once you got the proof that you can be good at something, then you become more confident. So that circle is something that is very interesting to study. But even then, one of my favorite persons of all time is Leonardo da Vinci. And I study Da Vinci a lot. And especially, I love, this is interesting. Maybe, I don't know if you do this, but I love studying what are some of the last words that great people spoke. So, for example, Da Vinci was, and obviously one of the most successful, one of the most incredible, not only artists but inventors of all time. And at the very end of his life, just before dying, he said, "I apologize to God and mankind because my work hasn't reached its full potential." Now we're talking about the guy that made the Mona Lisa, Vitruvius Man, and all these. So basically, the Last Supper, right? So two of the most prestigious paintings of all time, and by far the most prestigious drawing of all time, and still felt this way. So for you, perhaps, and this is a philosophical question, but for you, perhaps, not just how good is good enough, but how can we reconcile with this idea of loving us, of loving perhaps who we are, and not falling into this trap of being, of feeling perhaps sad or unfulfilled because of this sort of innate idea that we have as human beings that we can be greater or our potential could have been greater. Tell me more about that balance.
I think a lot of that, like you said, the confidence, it goes back to that confidence. But then I also think of, we live in a kind of competitive world, and we really need to get away from that. And so we look at other people and we're trying to compete with what they can do. And, even in school, you look at your grades and you're looking at somebody else's grade, and maybe they, understand something a little better than you. And, if they got an A and you got a B, then you say, well, I'm not as good as them. Things like that. So I think we do a lot of that competing. And, in the social media world, I think it's almost even worse, because I think a lot of young people, they look at somebody who is maybe even pretending to be so successful. Maybe they're really not, but they're pretending to be on social media. And so then they compare themselves to that person and they say, I can't live up to that. And I think we have to stop trying to compete with others. And I think we really need to figure out who we are. I think of back in, when I was in school, I never had anybody say, take the time to figure out who you are. What do you want to do? Who do you want to be? Nobody ever said that, and so I think that's really important, because when you start to look at who you are and what you want, then you start to see where your path might be. But so often we're looking at other people and what they're doing and thinking we have to keep up with them. And I think that really becomes a problem. And, so we really have to focus on our desires and our wants, because we're all unique.
I can agree with you more on this. I think that the Western world is a performance first world, and has been the case for a very long time. I think even more so after we won the Second World War. That's how I read history. But I really believe that I had an interesting conversation with one of our team member yesterday. Actually, we talked a lot about this concept of speed, and the fact that we're always looking for the next big thing, for the next what we could do perhaps, and so on. But really, and I was talking to her about this, I think that a lot of people are simply too focus on skipping levels instead of coming back to what really matters, which, like you said, is clarity. I think that a lot of folks, specifically folks my age, come at it to a point where they say, well, fantastic, I want to be, it's as good as podcasting as Joe Rogan. Well, Joe Rogan has made 5,000 episodes, my friend. Their first podcast episode, I'm going to tell you that right now, it's not going to be as good as Joe Rogan. And therefore, because of this innate abilities that we have to compare ourselves because we want to feel validated, I think that a lot of folks are trying to skip levels, even pretending, like you said, to skip levels just because it sort of make them feel good. And I think there's a real for problem there for not only the younger folks, but also all people, that then this cannot perhaps differentiate from this illusion of success and what success really means. And you talk about this quite a bit. That's first and foremost, freedom is the goal and not hustle. I think that we have a lot of pride in the hustle culture. Nothing wrong with it. Some people that I adore are hustlers, and they will call themselves hustlers. But there's a little bit of an ego driven thing there of being somebody basically that can go above and beyond and hustle constantly, perhaps for more and more. Now, you coach people on sustainability, right? So the fact that success is not just a thing that is, but it's something that you maintain, something that grows with you as your clarity gets better. So tell me, as this world is very rapidly changing, what does true freedom look like in the context of modern entrepreneurship?
I think that really goes back to what each person thinks of as freedom, because freedom and, to you might be something different than freedom to me. So that again goes back to really knowing who you are. I think most people want to be financially free. I think they want to have that time freedom. And there again, I think we have this competitive thing because you see some people who work very few hours are making millions of dollars. And, I think that becomes an issue too. And so getting back to that competitive thing. But when you were talking about skipping, oh my golly, that is exactly what I did when I first started my business because I had no direction. And what's interesting is, even though music was a thing I thought I was good at, when I was in college, I really wanted to get a business degree also. But I knew it was a financial strain on my parents. And so I couldn't stay another year or two to get that degree. So I graduated, got a job, started teaching. But it wasn't what I really wanted to do. I always wanted to go into business. And, when I did, I skipped all kinds of things because, I didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. And, so you'd have somebody would say, oh, you need to go do this or that. And I would go over there and do that and then nothing, and so then somebody else would say, oh, you need to do this. And so I'd run over to the other side and do that. And it just kept going on and on. And after I was in my business for a couple of years, I talked to this guy and he said, you never branded yourself. I'm like, what's branding? I don't know. And it was just, there was, to me, branding was colors and a logo. And,
Right.
It's so much more than that. And I didn't have that clarity. And I see this happening all the time, which is why I help entrepreneurs to really, get to, don't start doing Facebook ads if you don't even know what your message is. And yet that's what I did, and it's like, so I'm preventing people from making the same mistakes that I did, because if you don't have that strong foundation, it's like building a house. If you don't have that strong foundation underneath, everything on top of it's going to eventually crumble.
Yes. To me, I think that you were not born to just pay bills and die. I think that there is much more to life than that. And I think that this sometimes capitalistic behaviors really perhaps blur the line on what is best for us and what basically we think is best so that others validate us. I think that's the whole point of social media, is really sort of trying to fulfill this goal of ours to feel loved, to feel validated, to feel perhaps that we matter. I think that's really the bottom line of it. To me, the first time that I got into a room with people that was far, 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 far further than I was in life was when I sold my first business when I was 18 and got to Scottsdale to do my first public speaking engagement. And I'm a little kid from Quebec. Obviously, French is my first language. So anyways, got there with a broken accent. And it was a room of about 5,000 people, I'd say. But before I got into this room, all right, it was all very, very high performing people that had exit, people that had great businesses. I kid you not. I thought the men would be, 6'4", perfect shape. I had this sort of dream that they were all sort of Supermen. Really, that's really what I thought. Then I got into those rooms and I was like, man, I won't change my life for 99% of that rooms. Actually, I felt very good with myself, much better with myself actually, after sort of experiencing what others had to say on this. And really was because even in what we consider leaders, like you said with these retreats, they're dealing with the same problem. They're still having those limiting beliefs. And therefore, really, there's something to say about teaching leaders to lead themselves. I think that I see this perhaps paradox a lot in the marketplace today, where somebody's helping somebody else to do something that they're not even good at doing on themselves yet. And that there's a balance to strike there. And you really reaffirm that perhaps that balance with your background in educations, right? That really informs your belief that leader must master self-leaderships perhaps before leading others. Tell me about, we talk a lot about leadership, sort of a buzzword these days, but tell me what's the link between leaderships and internal mastery, this sort of concept that's mentor-mentee perhaps relationship.
Yeah, I think leadership has changed, particularly if you're thinking of like a boss and an employee. That has
Yeah.
changed drastically over the past few decades. But I also think about, leaders do have to study. And I think that's a piece that's really missing. I think it was Darren Hardy who was talking, and he was, about um, people who study personal development. And it's such a small amount of people, percentage wise, like maybe 5 to 10%. And you may get a few more that are being forced to come to it by their employer. And I remember one time before I went into my own business, I was doing some corporate training for a company. And the one seminar, it was a public seminar I was doing, this guy was so angry that he was there. And, I tried to go around the room and, get them to introduce themselves. And when he introduced himself, he said, "I don't even know why I'm here." Well, immediately I did. I could tell by his attitude, he was sent. And he got nothing out of that day because he was so angry that his boss had the audacity to think that he needed a little personal development of some sort. And,
All right.
I think sometimes, when we don't realize that we do have to learn more about ourselves and we have to become more aware. And when you become more aware of who you are, you become more aware of other people. And another training I went to once, we were doing things on personalities. It was the DISC training. And we were sharing, about ourselves. And I said, well, when we were kids, we grew up, blah, 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 blah. And this lady looked at me and she goes, "You have no idea what my childhood was like." And when she got to share, I was like, no, I had no idea what she had gone through. Her life was so far different than my childhood. And I think the more you start to listen to people, you start to realize that you sometimes have to put yourself in their shoes. And I know every once in a while, I'll be talking with somebody and they'll be really upset about what somebody said and what they did. And I said, well, let's go back. Let's look at it from their point of view, because we all are different people and we've all had different experiences and we all have different backgrounds and different things we've gone through. And as a leader, you have to be aware that, yes, you may want a project or, something to go in a certain way, but you have to realize that the people, that are following you, they don't have the same experiences that you have. And so you have to be aware of that. And, sometimes you have to work with people in a different way. You can't just come in as like this demanding boss. You have to realize that, there are differences in people and listen to other perspectives, because they may have an idea that you never thought of because they have a different background, or they may be able to relate to something a little differently because of the experiences that they had. And so I think, leaders have to really study, but they also have to learn to deal with the different personalities and to realize who they have working with them.
I think the way I see it is that a boss is demanding that the people that works for him basically do what he wants. And I think a leader is one that leads the way with people that work with him. I think the language is very important there. For me, with me. I can hear that a lot in the conversation that I had when people are using these type of words. You want to be careful. Want to be careful. Even the employees that I have and the partners that I have, I always try to remind myself that they're working with me, working for me. This concept of, again, hierarchy where there's a boss on top. I think you're right. I think that even from a corporation perspective, we've been seeing it evaporate more and more basically as time goes by. You talk about empathy. Empathy is a very misunderstood concept, I think, specifically in the Western world. How can one improve upon, well, first of all, what is your definition of empathy? But how can one improve, specifically a leader, upon their empathy to become more, become more better leader, perhaps?
Yeah, I think when you look at empathy, you have to, it's not an excuse, it's an understanding. And you can look at somebody and you can understand why they're maybe having a difficult time or why they're not doing something, but you have to guide them. And I think that's an important thing of a leader, is how do you guide somebody into, a different direction? And the only way I think you can do that is if you've studied yourself, because you really have to become more aware. And that conscious awareness is just so important, and being able to pick up on things, using your intuition to pick up on ideas or, pick up on somebody, how they're feeling, and being able to say, to understand, hey, what's going on, and that's probably a feeling you've picked up on. So I think it's really important for leaders to be really aware of what's happening with the people that they're working with.
Outside of learning from experience, what have you found to be the best way to study oneself?
For me, it's reading. But I'm a visual learner. So,
Okay.
I love to read books. And, that was one thing I really learned from Bob, because Bob would say, he studied every single day. Here's a man that had been doing it for 50, 60 years. And he studied every single day. And he said, sometimes I maybe just read a paragraph and think about it. Other times he might read more, but, his thing was, you've got to study every single day to keep on top of it. And I think it's just like anything else. If you're an athlete, you don't just practice one day a week. You practice every day. If you're a musician, you want to get good in that instrument, you practice every day. And I think it's just as a leader, you have to study every single day. And it could be listening, to a podcast. It could be listening to a program. It doesn't have to be something that you're stopping everything else to do. You could be listening to an audiobook. For me, that doesn't do it. I'm so strong as a visual learner that, I really have to read and think and do it that way. And the other thing I think as a leader is you need to make some type of a written plan or an idea, writing your goal down, getting your thoughts on paper of some sort, because there's something magical in writing it down. And that's been studied, and it's not good enough to type it. You have to write it down. And, that thought process of thinking and then writing it and seeing, you're touching more parts of you when you do that. And, that's part of the learning styles that people have.
Interesting. Yeah, we study biological preference a lot, obviously, with the type of work that we do. There's 11 profiles, so get to know yourself on that as well, because like you said, there's people like myself, like yourself, that are visual. I'm personally reading maniac. And I will ask you for a few of your favorite books in a second, but really, that's Brian Tracy, right? Writing things down is why I suppose he took it from somebody else, but I learned it from Brian Tracy, about having a goal, putting it down, basically afterwards breaking it down to what you can do not only basically next Monday, next week, but today to get closer to it. That is just you need a system. Right. There's just like Mr. Clear, James Clear, which is one of the favorite guide to sites. You don't fall to the quality of your goal or the height of your goal. You fall to the quality of your systems, and that's really the bottom line. Now, what are some of your favorite book on that, on self-development and self-improvement nowadays? And I'm saying this, and that's not my opinion. That's actually Nietzsche's opinion. Is in my opinion, sometimes feels like self-masturbation. That's what Nietzsche calls it. Do you want to be careful with who you get advice from? So for you personally, and a study under one of the great, let's be honest, what are some of your top books to get to know oneself?
So my favorite book, and I'll say my go-to book, is The Science of Getting Rich. And it's one I often give my clients because, first of all, if you're not used to reading or you don't do much reading, the chapters are short. And so that's always a plus. And they're so powerful. And I think a lot of times when people do have a book, you have to realize the goal is not to finish the chapter. The goal is to get something out of it and to study it. And so while I may encourage them to read through the book, then I want them to go back and really study, because books like that they're not like a novel. You know, you're reading to learn something. And every time I go back, and I usually study it every single year, I'll find things I didn't see before, because I'm different. My level of awareness is different.
Right.
So it's not like the book changed. I changed. And it's the same way, Think and Grow Rich. I, read that multiple times, but I just read it through like a novel and didn't get a whole lot out of it. And then when I met Bob, and of course that was one of his, go-to books, was Think and Grow Rich. I mean, he read something out of that every single day. And, for me, it was like, okay, I don't get it, because I wasn't reading it with the awareness. And now I read it and like, I do get it. And I do understand it, because I'm not the same person. So I like that one. I also like books by Neville Goddard. He was a great, I guess, philosopher. And, they're very deep. And again, you have to, for a lot of those books, if you read them, and Neville Goddard's particularly this way, if you read him the first time, you're like, it doesn't make sense to me. And you have to go back and really study it. Same with Thomas Troward. Thomas Troward's books are really difficult. I don't recommend anybody start with them, because many times I have to read it about 30 days in a row, a chapter, before I start to go, oh, now I kind of get it. It's just, very, very difficult, because partly it was because he wrote back in the early 1900s. So the language, is a little different what people wrote in the early 1900s. And, it's so full of information that you have to study it. And, you have to break it down and reread a paragraph, because your eyes kind of glaze over and like, I don't understand that. And so I think a lot of it goes to the real study and really getting something out of it. And realizing that with personal development and books like that, you do have to study them if you're going to understand. So with Think and Grow Rich, I remember I was in this book club locally, and a lot of times it was, here's the book we're going to study this month. And, I didn't always have a reference point, but the one month it was going to be Think and Grow Rich, I'm like, oh, I can really share with that one. That one I understand. And so I remember going to this book club, and I thought, this was the last time I went to the book club, because I realized I was in a room of people that didn't think like I did. And the first lady goes, I just couldn't get past the title. How do you think and grow rich? So she really didn't even open the book. Another one said, yeah, I started reading, and then I looked at information about Napoleon Hill, and I found, and she dug up like all this information that just was not what anything I've ever read about Napoleon Hill. And, and nobody had really finished the book. So I tried to take them and explain to them, a little bit about the book, and they just kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And, when I left that room, I was like, I don't think I really changed any of their opinions, because they were so set and so hung up on the title that they never really, and they were reading it like a novel, and they never really delved into, the nuggets of truth that were in there, and the stories they had in there, and how people changed their lives because of their belief system.
Absolutely. I did the same. I gifted that book to somebody that I know, and that was exactly their reaction, actually. She said to me, well, it only talks about money. And I said, no, that's... I know that there's some money on the covers, but I had the new version. I think the 50th anniversary basically versions. There's dollar bills basically around the cover, and she said, well, that's that talks about money. I said, well, there's a money component into it, but no, it's not. You'll see, it's about this self growth, perhaps, to become again who you not only who you're meant to become, but who you want to become. And so there's, I think there's to me, this concept of shielding yourself to learning, I believe, is one of the main red flag that there is something that is I think that is the worst limiting belief, is this concept that you think not only that you think you're not worthy of it. I think sometimes it comes from self-love. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but it comes a little bit from self-love, meaning that you're in a place where you don't think you're worthy of getting to know basically what is necessary for you to heal yourself, for you to become better. You don't deserve that. I think that's a huge thing that we see in the Western culture. I am not worth it of such things. Well, you could make more money. Well, no, I'm not worth it. Money is evil. I'm not worth it. I'm not worth such things. There's this big concept of worth. Where does that come from, do you think, by the way, culturally speaking, this concept of worthiness?
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about just goes back generations. And, if you go back and you look at history and you look at the ruling powers, the kings, the queens, they had an absolute rule. And so there was this power group, and everybody else was pretty much, worthless. And they the serfs, when you think back the time when, so many people were in that serfdom idea. And so it was just a small group of people that really understood any of these principles. And, they were all expendable, the other people, and so I think when you look at, the paradigms and the thought process that are in our subconscious, some of them come back from generations. So I think in the culture, there was all this feeling of, we were unworthy. And, I even remember one time, so my cousin's daughter was doing a genealogy for our family. And, well, for her family, for her parents, it was like a wedding anniversary gift for them. And so she was sharing with me that my uncle, which would be my blood relative, that we actually went back to French nobility. And I'm like, oh, well, isn't that nice? But she said on her mother's side, there was none of that, and so you just had that conflict. And I thought, well, that explains even how my grandmother behaved, because that would have come through her. And so I'm thinking, well, she was very prim and proper. And, I'm thinking all those things come down through families. And so you have that, feeling. And I think, you just go back to those generations and that unworthiness is there. And, so it is something you have to overcome, because again, it's a limiting belief. There's no truth to it. We are all worthy. We are all perfect when we're born, and we're all given this potential. And it's just how we utilize it. But when you get that feeling of unworthiness, or even I can remember my mom, she had this feeling that, well, we don't live on that side of the town. Well, there's people live over there in that hill, they're different than us over here on our hill, and it was just a money thing. And, it was, you just get that feeling. And again, that goes through how she was brought up, and it was, when you start to look at it, you can see that. So, it goes back gently.
To me, this concept of generational poor mindsets is one of the most, and God bless them, obviously, but it's one of the most sickening thing there is. I think that the really this comprehension that richness is evil, and they must do basically terrible things to be able to afford that house on the hill. This whole mindset is one of the most it's one of the most sickening thing from a culture perspective, but like you said, from a family lineage perspective, because it goes down and down and down and down and down. My mother works with people that lost their jobs and need help basically to find a new one. So they unpacked a lot from a psychological perspective, a lot of baggage, right? A lot of emotional baggage. Why did they lose that jobs? And sometimes there are people that have mental illness and other basically very difficult things. And she tells me all the time that it's very rare that it's an isolated experience. Typically, his mother is very similar, or his uncle that raised him is very similar, so on and so forth. So this family lineage things is a real thing, and generational traumas, perhaps that's what you call them, is definitely something to be aware of. I want to talk to you about the infamous, the law of attraction. There's a big there's debates all the time about the law of attractions. It's interesting because Bob Proctor says that the most universal law is the law of vibration, but he talks about the law of attraction still quite a bit. Not as much as Napoleon Hill, but still quite a bit. And there's a lot of skeptics. A lot of skeptics. I see it everywhere. Successful people that are skeptics, unsuccessful people that are skeptics. From your perspective, I suppose, how do you define the law of attractions, and how do you respond to the skeptics of people in which do not believe in such things? Rhonda Barn is one of my favorite persons to talk on this subject, right? Your thoughts become things. So I'm personally a big fan of it, but what's your take on all of that?
Yeah. So until I had started studying with Bob Proctor, I'd never heard of the law of attraction. And I'd never seen the movie The Secret. I'd never heard of that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think a lot of times, I think the world's starting to awaken. And I know when I first started my business, like 8 years ago, it was more like woo-woo, and it was hard to talk to people because they didn't believe you at all. But I feel like that even in, the past 5 years, it's really changing.
Okay.
And I think, like, when my son got that scholarship, that was the law of attraction. He was in the vibrational mode that he was getting the scholarship. He believed it. He, confessed it. He, just thought about it all the time, and he brought it to him because it should not have happened. And so because it did happen, it could have only happened through the laws of the universe. And I remember once I started to explain to him what he had done, because he had no clue. He was like, man, I wished I'd known that 10 years ago. I'm like, you wish you'd known 10 years ago. How about 40 years ago? But, it was kind of amazing. But, I looked back and this is what I try to get some of my clients to do. Look back in your history and see if there aren't times that you absolutely attracted something to yourself. And I know for myself, for a while, I had sold cosmetics, and there was a contest. And the contest, the top 3 cosmetic sales would win a diamond ring. And so I remember seeing those diamond rings, and I pictured those diamond rings on my finger every single day, all 3 of them. And, I was like, what's going on? I've never sold so much skincare, because that's where you really made your money, was not in the colors, but in the skincare. And, I kept having these parties that would have like $1,000 in sale. I'm like, how is this happening? Well, even after my son got that scholarship, that happened before he got that scholarship, and I won first prize, and which I overshot my goal because I really wanted the ring that was second prize, but I got the first prize ring. And so it was like, how did I do that? Well, then, after I learned what my son had done, I'm like, that's exactly what I did. And I think if people, it didn't even have to be that, but somebody wants a new car, and you go out and you find that car, and you're not sure how you're going to get it, but you start thinking about it. And all of a sudden you notice that car is all over the place, where before you never noticed it, because you're focused on it. And eventually you figure out how to get that car. And, the house we live in, it's the same thing. We weren't sure how we were going to get this house, but we used the exact same process. And I remember at the time, it wasn't exactly what we wanted. And so my husband built this picture of how we can make it into the house we wanted. Now, it took 10 years after we bought the house before we ever did that. But, it was like, you can build that dream. But when we started to do our remodel, we were like, where are we going to get the money to do this remodel? And you figure it out when the goal is right. And when you focus on it and you dream about it, that's the law of attraction. And so I believe that everybody at some point in their life has used the law of attraction, but they didn't understand what they were doing, just like my son, just like I didn't understand it. And so when somebody explains it to you and you start to look in your own life, you're like, oh my gosh, I did use the law of attraction. but you can't repeat it because you don't understand what you did. So once I was able to explain it to my son, when he came out of college, it was a really rough job market. He had a job the next week. He said, "Well, now what you're supposed to do?" Like, he just did it. And then he had this desire to study Japanese. I'm like, so my kids were all on this app together where they were doing different languages, and he chose Japanese. I said, why on earth would you pick a like Japanese, which is so difficult? Why not French? Why not Spanish? Something a little, one of those romance languages. And he goes, well, he was always interested in that Zen culture. And it was just, it was just fascinating to him. Well, here, 2 years later, he gets the opportunity for a job in Japan. He applies for it. He starts thinking about it. He's kind of scared and excited at the same time, which is what Bob always called the terror barrier. And next thing you know, he's in Japan. So, he just allows himself to focus and use the same things he did to get that scholarship. Now that he understands what he did, to keep moving forward in his life.
The first time I experienced something similar was with my sister. We're in the back of the car, and we played this game. I don't know if it's only popular in Quebec. It's very possible. But there's this game where you look for yellow cars because there's very few of them on the road. And when you find one, you punch the other one on the shoulder very slightly, just bugging each other. And we used to do this because we think we never see yellow cars. But then you start to play this game, and you see one yellow car, 2 yellow car, 4 yellow car, 8 yellow car. And that's the exact same concept, is that now that you are now wearing yourself on the goal, your brain, just like the skier, by the way, that's why they don't eat the tree when they're doing some slopes, is because they're focused solely on the slopes and finishing basically the trail. Is your brain is amazing at that. It's amazing at, once you find the objective, removing the obstacles and getting there in a very clear fashions. Now, you'll still have obstacles along the way. I'm reassuring you with that. It won't be the golden path. That simply doesn't really exist outside perhaps of a theoretical perspective of it. But still, I was amazed. It was the first time that I saw that, hey, we're seeing a lot of yellow cars there. We've never seen any, and now we've seen 12 in 10 minutes. So that was really something that was, I was conscious enough, even at that time, I was conscious enough to understand, oh, there's something there. We had this objective, and God, or call it whatever you like. I was an atheist at that time. My family was raised me as an atheist. Just, there's something there though, that really happened. So that is quite amazing. I want to finish, Patricia, with talking to you about productivity, because we were talking about this performance-based world, and you talk a lot about productivity, and most importantly, redefining productivity as not just doing more, but this alignment concept, right? Becoming more aligned, perhaps as a way to be more productive. And to me, and I always say this to everybody that I work with, partners, clients, employees, name them as you wish, being busy is not the same as being productive. Do not show me your calendar with basically no rest between your calendar slot and tell me that you have a productive day. It's possible if you understand what productivity means, but it's really possible that it was not a productive day, even if you have all these things that you're working on. So from your perspective, help us redefine that term, and then how do you help clients experience and shift in productivity once their mindsets change towards it?
Right. So that's kind of funny, because I was just doing an exercise yesterday for myself on this same thing. So you have that goal. And, first of all, you have to get the right kind of goal, one that inspires you, one that excites you, one that maybe you don't know how to achieve. And so I was figuring out what this goal was going to be for the fourth quarter of the year. And I was writing down, like what are 6 different activities that can be done that will assure me getting that goal and reaching that goal. And so it's not just the busy work. Yeah, sometimes there might be a little busy work that, gets there because life is life. And there are things that you just have to do. But what are the goal-achieving activities? And I think you have to look at that, and then you have to say, okay, so what can I do every day? So I'm having some type of goal achieving activity. So once you know what those goal achieving activities are for whatever, goal you want to reach, then you start breaking it down. So what do I need to do today? Or, what do I need to do this week? To make sure that I'm making progress, because it is that little bit of, work that you do every day that's taking you towards your goal that makes the difference. And I know exactly what you're talking about, because I could easily just say, oh my gosh, I was so busy today, and did nothing that really is going to move the mark. And that I fell into really early on because I didn't know what I was doing. And, that happens a lot. And so we have to make sure that, yes, there's going to be a certain amount of, like, we'll just say paperwork that needs to be done, but we have to focus first on these goal achieving activities and make sure we get them done, because they're the most important things.
Patricia Stepler, was an absolute pleasure to have you on the Meaningful Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for being so vibrant. It's really, we can feel it through the screen that you really are passionate about all of these things. And so it was a lovely conversations. And I would love if you can leave our audience with some last words of wisdom, please.
Okay, I think the most important thing we have to think about is we can never outperform the image we hold of ourselves. And we must first become the person, and then we will get the rewards. So we have to be that person first. And that takes work and knowing who we are.
Thank you for spending your time with us today on the Meaningful Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or share it with someone who could benefit from it. And always remember, your story matters. Make it meaningful. We hope to see you next time.